time for the defense opening statements. Let's listen in.
Good morning again, folks. Again, my name's Nate Prince, and like Mr. Fuchs says, I do want to, before I get into any of the evidence that we're going to talk about over the course of the trial, again, thank you for your time and attention to this matter. Obviously, there's a high-stakes case before you, and it's important to both the state and the defense. And so your careful attention to the specifics of the evidence and the testimony, as well as the arguments by counsel, is always appreciated. Opening statement is, as probably was apparent from Mr. Fuchs' argument to you, kind of our opportunity to give you a preview of what evidence we anticipate introducing during the trial. In addition to that, though, you're going to hear law from the court, which he'll instruct you about. The only thing that I ask you regarding the court's instructions to keep in mind as we go through the process of introducing evidence in this case is that the ultimate question you're going to be answering at the end of the trial is one of evidence. It's one that depends on the state proving beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt that the defendant is the person who committed this offense. You won't hear any dispute from the defense that this is the most heinous offense that's been committed in Tallahassee. There isn't any argument against that. The problem is that it wasn't Mr. Segura. And I know that because this is a heinous offense, you're going to want to see evidence that not only makes you feel comfortable returning a not guilty verdict, but also puts you at ease with the fact that the state really did fail to meet its burden. And so to that end, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the evidence that you're going to hear from the defense during the case. First and foremost, I want to talk about evidence pertaining to motive. Obviously, if the evidence pertaining to motive doesn't make sense or falls through or is rebutted by other evidence, then that's a problem for the state with its case. Mr. Fuchs told you about, and you will hear evidence and testimony indicating that Mr. Segura had recently had a $20,000 roughly child support judgment placed against him by Ms. Peters, by Brandi Peters, and that there were all kinds of consequences that went along with that. He was subject to being incarcerated. He was subject to having his driver's license suspended. He was subject to having his tax refund seized. He couldn't work internationally, as Mr. Fuchs said. Also, he couldn't get any professional licenses that he held or would have held renewed or granted in the first place, and his wages could have been garnished. What the state didn't know, what law enforcement didn't know when they developed that evidence, was that Mr. Segura was already in that position with someone else. Another child's mother that Mr. Segura had previously, Tamika Hawkins, who hates his guts but will testify on his behalf in this case, she had obtained a child support judgment of an almost identical amount some years before this happened, and it was still in place, which is to say he already couldn't travel internationally because Tamika Hawkins had a $20,000 judgment against him. He had already dealt with having himself put in jail and getting out by making a partial payment. He had already dealt with having his license suspended and getting it reinstated by making a partial payment. He had already figured out ways to work around having his taxes seized, which is to say that he would work on jobs where he could be paid under the table, and he would work all over the country so that it wasn't easy to find out where he was and seize his assets as they came in. He also, because he wasn't able to get professional licenses, worked jobs that he didn't have to have a professional license for. He would just take a competency test at the beginning of the job wherever he would go, and then he would perform his welding duties from there. Similarly, with the garnished wages, he had already figured out if he moved around and got paid under the table that he could avoid all of that. Ms. Hawkins will tell you that notwithstanding the fact that he didn't responsibly pay for their daughter, Janae, he was a father to her. He didn't, try to do anything in reprisal against Ms. Hawkins for having this child support judgment put on him. He just figured out a way to deal with. And I'll go ahead and tell you now, so that you're not wondering about this, Mr. Segura has not ever, and will not in this case at this time, hide behind his Fifth Amendment right, although he has a right to do that, and although you wouldn't be able to hold it against him if he did that. He'll take the stand, and he'll testify, and he'll tell you his side of the story. And what you'll hear, it's kind of difficult for me to articulate this, but Mr. Segura's quote is probably most apt, which is that there ain't no black man anywhere in America killing somebody over child support. That's just not something that happens. It's something that he says culturally, you just deal with. You know how to deal with. Nobody's killing anybody over child support, first and foremost. Now, one of the things that the state is going to try and point to during the course of the trial, evidence that they'll look to try and establish that there was some kind of beef brewing between Brandi and Mr. Segura here, was that there were text messages early in the week of the murder, on Monday, Tuesday that week, where she's saying, basically, you're a deadbeat, you're not paying, I'm going to have you put in jail and all this. However, there's a change of tone in the text messages that takes place prior to the murder. On Wednesday, Mr. Segura goes over to Brandi Peters' house. He's there for a short time, and basically what he's doing there is trying to chill her out. He figures, I'll just go see her in person, I'll explain what the situation is. And the situation was that Mr. Segura had been injured. He had been shot back in July of the same year, 2010, and he hadn't been able to work for some period of time. And so he had gotten behind on, all kinds of payments, not just child support, but all kinds of payments. And so he basically goes over there and talks to Brandi and cools her down. And the best evidence of that are Brandi's own words. Because on Thursday, we see that Brandi sends Mr. Segura a text message saying, hey, you were looking good yesterday. If you weren't my baby daddy, I would have given you some. Clearly indicating that the meeting on Wednesday went well. Immediately after that, and you're going to hear testimony all throughout the trial, that Mr. Segura is a well-known philanderer, basically. And the only difference between his philandering at the time of the murder and his prior philandering was that he wasn't supposed to be doing it anymore, which I know that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, but just so you have some factual background, you're going to hear testimony indicating that about a year and a half prior to the murders in this case, Mr. Segura had an infant son named Jalik who passed away because he was born prematurely. Prior to that point in his marriage with Malika Segura, his wife of 12 years or so, he had cheated on her a bunch of times. He had Janae out of wedlock. He had other girlfriends. He was constantly running around on her. After Jalik passed away, he and Malika got together and talked about what effect that was going to have on their marriage moving forward, and what, if anything, it meant for them from a spiritual perspective and all that. And Mr. Segura committed at that time that he wasn't going to run around on her anymore. Well, he didn't hold to that. He continued to run around on her, including with Brandi. And you're going to see evidence of how that ended up playing out. So understanding, with respect to the motive, that Mr. Segura already faced all of the consequences, was already subject to all of the consequences that the state will be indicating motivated him to have to kill Brandi. He was already subject to that. There were no new consequences other than the total value of money owed, which again he could easily get around and manipulate just by making partial payments. You can't talk about motive, though, without talking about the other folks who had motive to kill Brandi Peters. So you're going to hear about Carlos Santos, James Carlos Santos, during this trial. James Carlos Santos is a drug trafficker, a member of the Vice Lords, who brought Brandi in at some point in the 2000s to work for him as a mule. He would work with the Los Zetas cartel in El Paso and in Brownsville, Texas, pick up loads of drugs, bring them to the southeastern United States, Atlanta in particular, for distribution. He recruited Brandi to work as a mule for him, and she did indeed start working for him. At some point, he became aware that she was lifting drugs off the deliveries. It was a significant amount, and he knew at that point it was on him to take care of it. Otherwise, he would be taken care of by the Zetas. And so he set out to take care of the problem. Mr. Santos will testify in this trial. Mr. Santos will admit to you that he ordered the murders, that he orchestrated the murders, that he recruited a local trap team, DeMario Paramore and Haywood Griffin, who were other drug traffickers based in Tallahassee, not on the level that Mr. Santos was, to serve as the local guys to kind of show his team, his drug cartel associates, how to get in and out of Brandi's neighborhood. And that's exactly what happened. So you'll hear evidence and testimony about that from Mr. Santos. And I know that sounds strange that he's going to admit to that, but he has a specific reason for doing so, and he'll tell you about that as well. His face isn't clean, as the term goes. His face isn't clean until and unless he specifically takes care of the problem, because he's the one who brought Brandi in. He's the one who's responsible for her. So not only does he have to take care of the problem, he has to be sure that his cartel associates know that he's the one who took care of the problem. So that's why he's going to be here testifying. You're also going to hear testimony from the defense cartel expert, Dr. Dela Cruz. Dr. Dela Cruz will tell you generally about the relationship between South American cartel families, Mexican cartels, who generally serve as middlemen to deliver the product into the United States, and American criminal street gangs who receive drugs from Mexican cartels and deal them on street level, which is where the money is made. Another thing that Dr. Dela Cruz will testify about is the tactics used generally by cartels when they have to correct a transgression against their business interest. They don't do things that aren't theatrical. They're meant to be extraordinarily violent, extraordinarily gruesome, to shock everyone's conscience in order to send a message to anybody else that would presume to interfere with their business or tamper with their product. One of the things that Dr. Dela Cruz will offer you is a suggestion that, and to be clear, he has specific experience with first-person interviews, people who were associated with and members of the Los Zetas cartel. One of the things that they do is that they'll leave a calling card or instruct whoever is committing a murder in their name to leave a calling card at the scene so that it's well known that the killing was committed in order to vindicate their business interest. That happened in this case. In this case, next to the victim's body, there was a spade placed. The spade is in the spatter zone, which is to say, this was, and you'll hear testimony, this was a highly dynamic crime scene where Ms. Peters was fighting violently to save herself and her children. She was up and down off of the floor in the moments before she was killed, and that all of the carpet there is covered in blood spatter, which is basically splashing blood as the offense is being committed. The shovel was not apparently used in the murder. It had no DNA from Ms. Peters on it. It was placed there after the murder within the spatter zone, and no blood was found on it. All of that you'll be able to take into account when weighing what evidence supports the theory that the cartel had the motive and did, in fact, carry out the murders. You're also going to hear evidence about Mr. Paramore and Mr. Griffin, the local drug traffickers who Mr. Santos ultimately recruited to serve as the trap team to show his cartel associates the way in and out of Ms. Peters' subdivision. At some point during the course of the investigation, the Tallahassee Police Department received information from a man named Gregory Washington, who's a criminal defendant who was looking to get credit for himself on his own cases. They received information that Mr. Washington's cousin, who's Mr. Paramore, had confessed to being involved in these killings. The Tallahassee Police Department was familiar with Mr. Washington, so they didn't necessarily want to use him, but because of the seriousness of the case, they decided to do so. They documented him as a confidential informant, they put a wire on him, and they sent him to talk to his cousin, DeMario Paramore. When he did that, investigator Vinny Basio was listening on the wire, and he heard Mr. Washington elicit from Mr. Paramore statements indicating that he was, in fact, involved in the murder, that Brandi was killed because she didn't repay the drugs that she had taken, and that the children were killed because, quote-unquote, dead men don't talk. Investigator Basio will be called by the defense, and he'll offer that testimony here in open court for you to assess. Then you'll be able to consider the testimony of Haywood Griffin. Part of the reason Mr. Santos recruited Mr. Griffin and Mr. Paramore was that they were former business associates of a man named Kenny Green, who was basically Brandi's boyfriend. And Mr. Green and these folks had a falling out over drugs, Mr. Green's failure to repay them for fronted drugs, I suppose. Mr. Griffin, after being arrested on unrelated drug trafficking charges, was interviewed by the Tallahassee Police Department pertaining to his potential involvement in this case. First, he claimed, you'll hear, that he didn't even know who Kenny Green was. Then he said, well, I guess I did see Kenny Green at the jail one time. Then he said, well, I guess I kind of know who he is from around town. Then he finally admitted that he knew him. And then finally, at the end of the interview, he admitted not only did he know him, but they were former drug trafficking associates and that they had had a falling out. I'll ask you at the end of the case to consider why Mr. Griffin would lie about that if he had nothing to do with the case. An additional piece of evidence which ties Mr. Griffin to the scene of the murder in this case, is his own phone records. You'll see that his phone was communicating with the tower close to Brandi's house, facing the sector of the tower that is closest to Brandi's house, which is to say the directionality from the tower in which his phone was committing was towards Brandi's house. Now, that was also towards his own house. So his house was in the same sector of the same cell tower. So was that conclusive evidence that he was there at the scene? Absolutely not. And we don't have the kind of distance from tower data that Mr. Fuchs was talking about during his own opening for Mr. Griffin. So we don't know exactly how far his handset was from the phone, which would give us a better idea of whether he was at his own house or whether he was at Brandi's house. But that's all evidence that you'll be able to consider. The next general group of evidence you're going to hear is evidence pertaining to DNA. And at this point, I think it bears mentioning, and you'll hear testimony about this, exactly what the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is. So the Florida Department of Law Enforcement is exactly that. It's a law enforcement agency that develops all types of physical evidence for the state. So they have shoe impression experts, they have DNA experts, they have blood spatter experts, experts of all kinds. And on criminal cases every day all around the state, every prosecutor in every jurisdiction in the state sends evidence to FDLE for further analysis. Generally, the state attorney's offices all over the state are not required and don't go outside of FDLE to hire independent contractors like private attorneys do. They have a state agency specifically for that. And that took place here. In this case, there were over 200 evidentiary samples taken from the crime scene and other scenes, and those were sent off to FDLE. The person who will report either, I don't know if she'll be called by the state or by the defense, but effectively, Jo Ellen Brown, a senior analyst from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement, will testify as a defense expert, insofar as she's going to testify that Mr. Segura was not included to a single evidentiary exhibit found at the crime scene. She will, however, testify that other foreign DNA was found in places relevant to the investigation, relevant to the case. So the first place we're going to talk about is on this phone. So this is a phone in Brandi Peters' bedroom. You'll be able to see as the evidence is introduced that the phone was ripped out of the phone jack, which appears there on the picture. The phone was ripped out of the phone jack, and in addition to being ripped out, the cord was also cut. And you'll see scuff marks along the wall here, which will be testified about by the defense reconstructionist, the former homicide investigator Michael Knox, indicating that there was a struggle over the phone and that the phone was ripped out of the wall at some point. So, and the reason I'm talking about the phone and why it's relevant is because this isn't just some surface. It's a surface that circumstantial evidence supports the notion there was an altercation right there over that phone. One of the people that Mr. Santos will tell you was involved in the commission of this murder is Angel Avila, a Colombian national. Mr. Avila was a big-time drug trafficker as well. He had been previously indicted by the federal government in a major drug trafficking operation, and was subsequently deported back to Colombia after he had his sentence reduced in 2009. What Dr. De La Cruz will explain is that a lot of times when somebody testifies against a cartel or against their family, they're required to do something called wet work in order to claim their face. I'll use that expression again. Once they've testified against a cartel asset, a cartel member, that they may be required to do wet work in order to save their own lives. And so in this case, that's exactly what Mr. Avila was required to do. Mr. Avila's DNA, as it were, was found on that phone. So when Jo Ellen Brown from the Florida Department of Law Enforcement comes in and testifies, one of the things that she'll say is she developed a complex mixture of DNA from a swab of this phone cradle right here, the phone cradle that was fought over where the cord is ripped out of the wall and cut. One of the contributors to that mixture was Mr. Avila, as it ultimately turned out. Now, Jo Ellen Brown didn't do that testing. She was the one who developed the profile for comparison. Later, the government was able to obtain a buccal swab from Mr. Avila. A buccal swab is basically just where they take a cotton swab and stick it in somebody's mouth and get some saliva on it, and from that they can develop a DNA profile. And when that happened, the DNA profile was developed for Mr. Avila, and he was matched to the DNA found on that phone right there. In addition to the DNA found on the phone, there was foreign male DNA found on the shovel that was placed next to the victim's body. And you'll hear testimony throughout the trial talking about the difference between touch DNA and other forms of DNA that can be deposited by saliva or semen or touching something, blood. All of those means are ways that blood can, or DNA rather, can be deposited on a particular item. So we've got DNA on the phone cradle that matches Mr. Avila. We've got foreign male DNA on the shovel placed next to the victim's body. Mr. Segura, by the way, is excluded as a contributor to the foreign male DNA found on the shovel. We also have foreign female DNA found under the victim's fingernail. And one of the things that you'll see is that Brandi Peters fought valiantly in this case for herself and for her children, to the point where all her knuckles are broken and bruised and her acrylic nails have been ripped off. And under those fingernails was found foreign female DNA. The reason that that's relevant is that Dr. Dela Cruz will tell you that a general cartel tactic is to send a female. If they're going to do a hit at somebody's house, they'll send a female to the door because they're less threatening and more likely to get access. And Mr. Santos will tell you that's what happened here, that a female was sent to the door. When Brandi saw the rest of the folks coming, that's when she ran inside. So we've got foreign female DNA under her fingernails as well. And then we've got foreign male DNA recovered at a cleanup scene. So Jack McLean Park, it's like a quarter mile from Brandi Peters' house. In one of the back pavilions, so when you go in Jack McLean Park, you can go kind of straight into the left where the pool is, basketball courts and the main bathhouse and all that. But you can also turn right and go way to the back of the park. And at the very back of the park, there's a bathhouse there as well. Outside that bathhouse was a trash can with contents that were set on fire. It was discovered about a week after the murder. Inside the trash can were some bloody latex gloves, 6 pairs. There were an empty shop towel box. There was a gallon of bleach. And then inside there were bloody paper towels in the toilet and on the floor. And ultimately, those items, as well as some bloody shirts that were found inside this trash can, were sent off to FDLE for testing. Diane Guzman, another FDLE analyst and expert, will testify that foreign male DNA, which excluded Mr. Segura, was found on those shirts. Finally, I want to talk just briefly about Mr. McElfresh. One of the things that Joe Ellen Brown and Jason Bundy, two Florida Department of Law Enforcement experts that will testify effectively as defense experts in this case, is the importance of blind testing, which is to say a scientist doesn't want to know a theory necessarily when they're going to do their analysis. They don't want their interpretation. And there is a lot of gray area in DNA interpretation that you'll hear about. They don't want their opinions to be influenced by knowledge of an investigative theory. In this case, what happened was Mr. McElfresh was retained by the state attorney's office way back at the beginning of the case, 2010, 2011, and he was sent all the material that was developed from all of the evidentiary exhibits that were developed. He went through, he looked at all the electropherograms, which are charts that you'll hear discussed and you'll see during the course of the trial. Basically, whenever a DNA sample is tested, it produces a document which shows something that looks kind of like an EKG with peaks all over it. And so Mr. McElfresh received all that information, and he was specifically asked to look at all of the complex mixtures and see whether he disagreed with any of Joe Ellen Brown's findings or to see whether he could do anything different. He never reported to anybody that he could do anything different with the swab of the bath bar. It wasn't until 2017 that when he was called up and specifically asked to look at the swab of the bath bar again to see if he could do something different, that he finally said, oh yes, you know what, as a matter of fact, Mr. Segura is included as a contributor to the swab of the bath bar. Now, one thing that I'll ask you to listen to carefully is that is partially true. Mr. Segura's DNA is on the bath bar. And the reason his DNA is on the bath bar is because his son's DNA is on the bath bar. Joe Ellen Brown will testify that Javante Segura is included as a contributor to the mixture on that bath bar. What that means is that because he's Mr. Segura's son and half his DNA comes from Mr. Segura, you're going to see a lot of numbers that pop up on that sample that are consistent with Mr. Segura. But because there's interrelated individuals contributing to the mixture, no determination at all can actually be made about Mr. Segura's contribution to that mixture. Jo Ellen Brown will tell you that. She's a Florida Department of Law Enforcement senior analyst, or now retired, former Florida Department of Law Enforcement senior DNA analyst. Jason Bundy, a regional director for the Florida Department of Law Enforcement DNA supervisor, will tell you that as well, as will the defense expert Kevin Knoppinger. They all agree on the point that Mr. Segura cannot be determined to be a contributor to the DNA mixture found on the bath bar. Only Mr. McElfresh, who was hired by the state to come in and do extra work in this case, will testify to that finding. You're also going to hear a lot of testimony about the forensics in this case. And generally what I mean when I'm talking about forensics is crime scene processing. So that includes blood spatter analysis, like we were talking about before, bullet trajectory analysis, interpretation of wounds, if there are any to be interpreted, and all of that. And so what you'll learn happened during the course of the testimony is that the altercation started in Brandi Peters' bedroom, which is this room over here. Mr. Knox will tell you that he knows that that's where the altercation started, at least where the violence started, because of the amount of blood deposited in the room. It's the smallest area of Miss Peters' blood present in the house. And then there are directional swipe marks as well as blood spatter pattern falling throughout the hallway as she comes towards the front of the house here, comes down the hallway, gets to the front door. There are directional swipe patterns on the door, again, Miss Peters' blood. Ultimately, she makes it out of the house. We know that she makes it out of the house as we go through each of these pictures. So there's blood from Miss Peters on the floor. There's a bullet fired in the bedroom that misses her and goes out the window. There's another bullet that's fired within her bedroom that travels into this hallway closet right here and is discovered there by law enforcement when they process the scene. And there are two more bullets found in the bedroom, in the bathroom attached to Miss Peters' bedroom. So just for reference, the two bullets that were found next to Miss Peters' bedroom in her bathroom are right in there. So like I said, eventually Miss Peters, you can see the swipe marks here, makes her way out of her bedroom, down the hallway. This is towards the front of the house here, depositing blood on the walls as she goes. You see blood spatter there on the walls. Mr. Knox will talk to you about the directionality of that blood spatter and what direction it indicates Miss Peters is moving. You'll also see indications that the struggle was ongoing. She was shedding jewelry as she went. There was an earring located on the floor in the hallway there. And we see, again, more transfer patterns as she makes her way towards the front of the house. Outside the house is blood spatter, which is impact spatter, indicating Miss Peters is being struck at that point outside the house. And there's blood spatter going in both directions. Back inside the house, you'll see from the blood spatter, and you'll hear testimony about the dynamic nature of the struggle. One of the things that Mr. Knox is going to tell you about is the fact that there are handprints on the walls, the fact that there's spatter going up both walls and all the way up to the ceiling is indicative of a moving crime scene, which is to say that the assailants are moving as well as Miss Peters throughout the attack. One of the things that Mr. Knox is also going to tell you about is the shoe impressions that were found at the scene. And this is an important point, because the state's theory is, and always has been, that Mr. Segura committed this murder by himself. There's absolutely no evidence indicating that he did anything in concert with anybody else at any point relative to these murders. And so there were 5 separate shoe impressions, or potential shoe impressions, that were located in the blood around Miss Peters' body. Highly relevant is that these shoe impressions are all different. So 5 distinct shoe impressions, not from the same shoes. All right, so that's indicative of 5 different people at least being involved here. Another thing that's highly relevant about that is that law enforcement was excluded by another Florida Department of Law Enforcement expert as having deposited the shoe impressions. So Greg Mion from Tampa, he's a FDLE footwear impression expert. He's going to come in and testify whether the state calls him or the defense, he's effectively a defense expert, that there are 5 separate impressions and that law enforcement's shoe impression standards were excluded as having contributed to any of these. And again, it's important because it indicates clearly that multiple individuals were involved in the commission of the offense. Other evidence tending to indicate the same thing, that is, that multiple individuals were involved in the commission of the offense, are the number of weapons used. So Mr. Knox will also testify that between the wound patterns exhibited on Ms. Peters and the impact spatter or blood spatter discovered at the house and photographed here, it's highly, highly unlikely, if not impossible, that a firearm could have created cast-off that high. And what that means, cast-off, is as a weapon is being swung and it's getting blood on it, when it goes back, it slings blood. And so what Mr. Knox is going to tell you is that in order for the blood to have been cast off at the height that it was cast off in this case, it would have required a longer item than a firearm. He says that most likely is something at least 2 feet long, like a crowbar or something to that effect. Besides the height of the cast-off, as you see here, we're going to hear testimony and you'll see pictures of the different types of injuries that Ms. Peters sustained. And I hate to put these in front of you first thing in the morning, but of course they're highly relevant. Now, can it be determined, or will anybody testify with absolute certainty that all of these wounds were made by different weapons? No, but there's other evidence which indicates that that's true. So you have these crescent-shaped injuries here as one type of injury. You have a number of puncture wounds that are a different type of injury. You have a crush injury in the back where the skull is actually fractured. This is another picture of that same type of injury. There's an oval picture that I didn't, put the gruesomest angle in front of you here, but that's a totally different pattern from the other ones shown so far. And then directly on top of her head, there's a perfect circle. Again, totally inconsistent with being deposited by a firearm, any part of a firearm, the barrel, the handle, anything. As you can see there, it's 4 centimeters in diameter, so it's roughly the size of the end of a baseball bat. Not that that's what it was, but that's more akin to the type of weapon that would have been used. And that's a close-up of the oval. You're also going to hear testimony throughout the case pertaining to the time of death. Now, Mr. Fuchs has already kind of conclusively stated that Ms. Peters died, between 6:53 and 7:37 when we see Mr. Segura texting. But that's not what the evidence actually indicates. It is true that her phone goes inactive and there are only passive events after 6:53. But we know that Ms. Peters was still alive when her phone died, when her phone ran out of juice. There's both circumstantial and direct evidence to support that notion. So one piece of evidence that supports the notion that Ms. Peters was still alive when her phone ran out of juice at 8:21 is that we know she ran for the landline. Now, obviously, if you go to a landline when you're being attacked, you can't move around. You can't lock yourself in a bathroom. You can't lock yourself in a closet. And we know that she was going for the landline in this case because we saw scuff marks on the wall. The line was cut. The cord was pulled out of the phone jack. More relevantly, Ms. Peters' sister, Monica Peters, told Officer Jernigan from the Tallahassee Police Department the day after the murder that she last spoke to Ms. Peters at approximately 10 o'clock p.m. the night before, which would have been the 19th, indicating that she was still alive at 10 p.m., which you'll see as we get into the cell phone records, is a half an hour after Mr. Segura is home. She's still alive at 10 p.m. And there's not going to be a dispute about that, just to kind of give you a preemptive view of the testimony pertaining to cell phone towers and the information extracted therefrom. Both Sergeant Corbett for the Tallahassee Police Department and the defense cell expert, John Sawicki, will testify that Mr. Segura's handset traveled home back down to Woodville, and he was home by 9:31 p.m. and then remained down in Woodville for the remainder of the evening, active on his phone. He was texting back and forth with one of his girlfriends trying to set up a hookup for later that night. With respect to the time of death, what I will end up ultimately suggesting is the most compelling evidence of time of death comes from a combination of Dr. Flanagan and neighbor Marquise Davis's testimony. So Marquise Davis lives directly across the street from Brandi Peters at the time of the murder. Marquise Davis is friends with Brandi Peters, and at that time, he's the live-in boyfriend of C.C. Timmons, whose name you already heard. C.C. Timmons was Miss Peters' best friend at the time. And Mr. Davis had a relationship not only with Brandi as a friend, but also with the children. It wasn't uncommon at all for him, since he was home most of the time, to make dinner for the kids. That would happen at least a couple of nights a week. The two twin girls, Tamaya and Tanaya, as well as Javante, would eat dinner over at C.C. Timmons' house because they played with Miss Timmons and Mr. Davis' children. So Mr. Davis is going to testify. And again, it's relevant when Mr. Davis's testimony came to light because he did not voluntarily go talk to law enforcement following the murders, notwithstanding that he potentially had information that was relevant. That may be hard for some folks to understand, but what Mr. Davis will tell you when he testifies is that he's an African-American man on felony probation, and there are no circumstances when he's just going to go up and voluntarily speak to the police. So his testimony didn't come to light until the defense team found him in 2017. What he testifies to is that on the night of the murders, although the kids ate Burger King at 4 o'clock or so, he made them dinner, and they ate dinner around 7 o'clock at his house. He also sent a plate of food over to Brandi for her to eat as well. Mr. Segura was there at that time, and he will tell you that she ate that food as well. That's significant because when paired with Dr. Flanagan's testimony, Dr. Flanagan says the food in all 4 victims' stomachs was digested for about 3 hours as of the time of their death. That puts the victims alive till at minimum 10 o'clock, half an hour after we already know Mr. Segura is home and never leaves Woodville again for the rest of the night. We'll also hear testimony from Dahana Scott, who was the neighbor immediately adjacent to Brandi Peters' home. Ms. Scott will say, there is one other thing that's important to talk about with Mr. Davis before I move on to Ms. Scott. Mr. Davis, after feeding the children and sending a plate of food over to Ms. Peters' house for her to eat, he ended up taking a serving to his father across town. So he leaves his own house 7:30 or thereabouts, goes to his dad's house, takes him some oxtail soup, and then comes back. When he comes back, he sees there's a dark-colored SUV in the driveway. This is important because either that person is there killing Miss Peters, or more likely, it's just a friend who's come to visit her. In any event, it indicates that she's still alive at that moment in time. If it was just a friend, obviously, who discovered the bodies, they would have reported it at that point in time, but no report was made. Now, with respect to Ms. Scott, Dahana Scott, the neighbor adjacent to Brandi Peters, when she got home from work at 10:50 or so, she noticed a white SUV in Brandi's driveway. At some point thereafter, perhaps around 11 o'clock, her dog starts going crazy like he never goes, right at Brandi's fence. So he's running back and forth, barking, going crazy, to the point that another neighbor, Darius Mount, who lives down the street from Brandi, comes outside, hears the dog. It's so out of the ordinary that he actually calls law enforcement sometimes in the early morning hours of November 20th. Again, that's only circumstantial evidence, but it is actual evidence that you can pair with the scientific evidence from Ms. Flanagan and the testimonial evidence from Mr. Davis. You're also going to hear specific testimony from Mr. Segura about where he was and what he was doing throughout the day on the day of the murder. And you're going to see how the cell phone tower data corroborates everything that he says. So first, let's talk about, since we're going to get into the cell phone stuff and the evidence that you'll hear regarding the cell phone data, the Star 67 stuff, which Mr. Fuchs characterized as trying to hide his number or deceptive. What you'll see, if you want to go through all the records, and again, you'll get a big, thick packet of phone records, every single time Mr. Segura calls Brandi Peters, every single time he Star 67s her from his girlfriend phone. And that's what this phone was, he'll tell you. He's, like I said, he'll take the stand and testify that he had the second phone because he was cheating on his wife with all these other women, at least 3 other ones, during this time period. And he used that phone primarily to communicate with his girlfriends. The reason he didn't want Brandi having that number is because she's one of those people that blows your phone up if she has your number. She needs something or she wants something, she wants to get a hold of you. He didn't want to be getting 15 calls while he was with one of his other girlfriends. So he never let her know that number, although she knew it was him when he would call from that blocked number. That's why you see him talking to her for an extended period of time. So I referenced before that there was a text message from Brandi on Thursday, the day before the murders, wherein she says to him, hey, you were looking good yesterday. If you weren't my baby daddy, I would have given you some. That starts a sequence of calls back and forth between Mr. Segura and Ms. Peters. Those calls go back and forth all throughout the day on Friday, which is, again, the date of the murder. And you'll see where Mr. Segura is, and he'll tell you where he was and what he was doing. Basically, his entire day that day is designed around going over to Ms. Peters' house and having sex with her. That was the plan that they had kind of come up with after they started talking and flirting and all this again. You see the text message on Friday that Mr. Fuchs referenced where she was asking if he hung up on her. He'll testify about that. It wasn't a hang-up. She was at school picking the twins up at that point and got cut off. He ended up calling back later. In any event, you'll see that he went over to her house around 1:30 or so. She wasn't home. He calls her. She's not there, so he goes over to his sister's house, Mr. Segura's own sister's house, Sean Segura, hangs out there for a little while. Brandi says in another later phone conversation that she should be home maybe around 3:30 after she picks the girls up. So Mr. Segura goes back and parks his vehicle around 3 o'clock at a church near Brandi's house. The reason he does that is because anytime he's hooking up with somebody, he's not going to park in their driveway because he's afraid his wife will find out. And again, he had made this promise to his wife that he wasn't going to cheat anymore, and he didn't want word getting back to her that he was, in fact, still cheating. So he goes over there. He has sex with Miss Peters. He uses a condom, which is why there's no semen or DNA evidence of that sort. And afterwards, he hangs out for a little while. Javante and the twins come back. They've eaten. They sit there and watch TV for a while. You see data use sessions during the 7 o'clock hour where he's on his phone checking email and things of that nature. And then ultimately he leaves. It appears that he leaves, based on his phone records, at about 8:21 p.m. I say 8:21 p.m. because at that point his phone is traveling back down. I think it's Paul Russell towards South Monroe so he can go back to Woodville. And that's where he stays for the rest of the night. Again, Sergeant Corbett and John Sawicki, the defense cell expert, will testify uniformly about that Mr. Segura's testimony is consistent with what the cell phone tower data shows. Now, Mr. Fuchs did make a point to indicate that Brandi's phone was inactive, from whatever time it was. 6:53 was her last active communication, and then gets shut off or is out of juice at 8:21 p.m. However, we don't have her landline records still to this day. And again, remember that her sister said she talked to her at 10 o'clock p.m. Now, Mr. Segura did lie when he was interviewed by the police about being there at Brandi's house. I've already explained what his motivation for him not wanting to find his wife to find out that he was engaged still in extramarital affairs. One thing that I would ask you to keep your ears open for and pay attention to when you hear this testimony come out, Mr. Segura didn't tell any lies during his police interviews that were unique to Brandi, which is extraordinarily important. When he's asked about Natasha Hawthorne, another one of his girlfriends, he lies about her too and says that he's friends with her, that he's not hooking up with her. And Investigator Lewis kind of pokes him about that and asks about that, and no, she's just a friend. So he's not only lying about Brandi, he's lying about every woman with whom he's having an extramarital affair. And beyond that, you'll be able to see that when Mr. Segura is going through his interviews with law enforcement, Investigator Lewis starts to sense that this has something to do with him hooking up with Brandi. At one point, you'll see, because Mr. Fuchs is going to play the recorded interview with Mr. Segura, Mark Lewis asks him, is there something going on with you and Brandi? Look, I'm not the morals police. I don't care that you're married. He senses it, because like Mr. Fuchs says, he does this for a living. And he senses that Mr. Segura is not being honest, and he senses that it's about marital infidelity. And so he asked that question, but Mr. Segura says no. Ultimately, Malika Segura does find out, which is why you'll hear a jail phone call that the state has after Mr. Segura got arrested a year later, where he's saying, yeah, looks like I gave up my life for you, talking to his wife, Malika, indicating that he lied to try and protect their marriage from, the destructive information that ended up coming out, and their marriage ended as a result. You're also going to hear evidence from Investigator Lewis about Mr. Segura's lack of emotion. And Mr. Segura is going to talk about that to you. Like we talked about in jury selection, a lack of outward expression of emotion is not a lack of emotion. Look, Mr. Segura is a tough guy. You know, he's a blue-collar guy. He's a tough guy. He'll tell you that when he was a kid, if he cried, his dad would punch him in the arm and tell him, men don't cry. And so that's not something he does. Even when his son, Jalik, died, like, he was a basket case. But he didn't cry about it, like literally cry, because that's not a thing that he does. He buries it, and he tries to carry on. For lack of a better expression, he tries to be a man. That doesn't mean that he's got a lack of emotion. He'll tell you what he was feeling. He was feeling a lot of complicated things that were pulling him in multiple directions. He was doing the best that he could under the circumstances to do what he always does, which is be strong and soldier on. Part of the ambivalence about his feelings, or part of the mixed bag of feelings that he was going through, were guilt. You know, he didn't have a firm idea of whether Javante was his son at that point, and so he hadn't been an involved dad like he had for his other out of wedlock children, like Janae. Every time he and Brandi would fight, she would tell him that Javante wasn't his kid, and he had actually filed paperwork to do a paternity test and see if Javante was in fact his son prior to the murders. So he was in the process of trying to determine that. He had a volatile relationship with Brandi, which impacted his emotions, of course, and didn't know for certain that Javante was his son. But that doesn't mean that he didn't feel emotions. He was reflecting a lot of the outward mood that Investigator Lewis was projecting, and so Mr. Segura was kind of mirroring that, you know. And he'll tell you too, part of the thing is that he, as an African-American male, is generally uncomfortable talking to law enforcement anyway. And so that's another thing that was kind of playing into his attitude at the time. So just keep that in mind when you hear testimony from Investigator Lewis that's trying to, you know, draw a connection between his apparent lack of emotion and, you know, the profile, I suppose, of somebody who would commit this type of offense. Like Mr. Fuchs said, you will hear evidence that Mr. Segura had a .32, but this was months before the murders occurred in this case. What actually happened there is that in July, Mr. Segura was on a job and he got a call from a cousin of his, and he'll tell you about this when he testifies. His cousin had crossed some guys. I guess his cousin was a drug dealer or drug user or something, and he had crossed somebody up in Mississippi. So Mr. Segura, since he was on his way back from a job anyway, stopped in Mississippi. He usually carries a firearm with him legally when he's on these jobs, because he's around drug users that serve as laborers on these contract jobs all the time, all over the country. And so he'll usually have a firearm on him, and in this specific instance, he had a firearm on him. It was a .32. And what happened was, when Mr. Segura got to Mississippi and was dealing with his cousin, at some point, the guys with whom the beef existed came to where they were. They pulled a firearm. He pulled his firearm in self-defense. They shot at him, and he was shot. He shot back. After that occurred, he got rid of the gun because he was involved in a shooting, and then went and got treatment. He was still recovering from that gunshot wound at the time of the murders in this case. So when Mr. Fuchs talks about him being a big, strong guy capable of exerting superhuman strength, just keep that in mind, that he hadn't even returned to full work yet because he was shot in the abdomen and the bullet traveled through his abdomen and finally lodged down in his groin. There are medical records that the defense may introduce to show you that as well. Lastly, when you're talking about the evidence that's going to come out in a case like this, it's important to keep in mind a lack of evidence as well. So important pieces of evidence that are missing include evidence of blood transfer and evidence of injuries. Mr. Knox is going to tell you that these offenses were incredibly violent. This was a very dynamic crime scene, again. And you'll see from the wounds to Ms. Peters' hands that she fought back. Her knuckles are broken here. Her fingernails are ripped off. You see one of her acrylic nails on the floor right here. These knuckles are all bruised and swollen. Same thing here. Mr. Segura, however, this is a picture taken the day after the murder, has no cuts, no scratches, no nothing on him. The only thing that he had was, you'll see down here, you can barely see it, of course, he had a tiny little scratch because when he went down to Silas Thornton's house the day after the murders on November 20th, they were shooting arrows in Mr. Thornton's backyard. Mr. Segura fired one past the target and had to go into a picker bush to get it back. That's the only scratch he had on his entire body. That's it. Additionally, you'll hear testimony from Mr. Knox pertaining to the fact that there would have been, the person or people who were involved in the commission of these offenses would have been covered in blood because of the saturation, because of the spatter that occurred while the wounds were being struck. And there is no blood transfer in any of Mr. Segura's vehicles. All his vehicles are messy, so it's not like they've been cleaned up. You'll see pictures of them. There's no blood found anywhere that ties him to the victim. There's no, blood on clothes that they find at his house. There's no gloves with blood relevant to the crime that they find at his house. So just keep in mind those important pieces of missing evidence as well as we go through. I know I've just kind of thrown a lot at you, but I wanted to give you a thorough preview of what I expect the evidence to be so that you can, number one, be aware of what's coming and think about ahead of time how all that evidence fits together. And at the end of the day, if you follow the instructions of the court, which require you to return a not guilty verdict in the event that the state fails to prove beyond and to the exclusion of every reasonable doubt, which again is any doubt which is not speculative or imaginary, that is based on evidence, you'll find Mr. Segura at long last not guilty of these offenses.